Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm here with our good friend, our reoccurring guest, David Kirkpatrick. How you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Well, you are becoming a regular, my friend, and I think it goes, saying it. You seem to know something, right?
At least I can fake it. Maybe one of the two. We'll go with the first one, hopefully.
Yeah. And now we're going to keep this rolling of these frontiersmen in Kentucky, and we're going to talk about James Harrod, somebody near and dear to you in Mercer County, correct?
Absolutely.
There's Oh, go ahead.
If you live in Mercer County or any of the surrounding areas, you make the pilgrimage to Fort Harrod in school, and he's a big deal.
He's the big deal, and sometimes the forgotten, settler of Kentucky. I know there's not a serious rivalry, but you got the people from Boonesboro, people from Fort Harrod. Fort Harrod was first. I'm sorry, everybody. That's just the way it is.
That's right.
So we're going to talk about him, his life. There's a little bit of mystery. He's one that has a bit more mystery than any of these other kind of frontiersmen and so forth. And that's surrounded his death. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about that at the end.
Right.
So let's get started with just James Harrod, the person first. Lived a pretty good life, but a frontiersman. He was born in Pennsylvania, but his life didn't, I guess, go without tragedy. If that's a good way to start it off.
Yeah, absolutely. Harrod, like Boone, was born in Pennsylvania and a little bit farther west, but they're actually not too terribly far from each other. There's some debate about when he was born. 1746 is given as a date. 1742 is also given because he's in service in the French and Indian War. And if it's 46, he is really, really young.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's still possible. But we see as a child, Boone's father dies, and so his mother is left with, I think, with 12 children. He's one of 12. And it's a hard life on the frontier. At one point, they have to kind of evacuate their home and fall back a little bit. And she really led that family and prepared them. But as Harrod grows older, the French and Indian War breaks out, and he and his brothers, you're automatically in the militia if you're on the frontier, like it or not.
Yeah.
And he and his brothers see service at Fort Frederick, but mainly Fort Littleton, which was a small fort out there. And when you're younger, he's probably working at the fort more than going out on missions. But at one point, he does serve as a ranger. And of course, when that war is over, for the European powers, it continues for the Americans because you've got Pontiac's Rebellion. And of
Yeah.
course, for the British, I guess the British government too, but the colonists face the brunt of that. And so Harrod is part of the defense force for that as well. So even at a young age, he had seen quite a bit.
Yeah, quite a bit. And you're talking about his birth. Whenever we made our little short video that's on the YouTube channel about his life, I put down 1742 to 1746. Not really sure on that one because there's a little bit of age you got to be considerate of because in the military and so forth.
Right.
Yeah, but him fleeing when his family fled from their uh, I guess it was Great Cove, Pennsylvania.
Mhm. Yes.
Um, Native Americans were burning houses. I mean, it was kind of one of those traumatic scenes. And I mean, he was pretty young. He wasn't that old of a guy. Um, but yeah, so he of course, like many people, I mean, Boone included. Quick question is, I think I was about to say, most of these frontiersmen were in the army in a sense of, or the militia or so forth at some point. But Simon Kenton he I'm thinking that he may not have been as much, but I know he fought in many battles, but
Mhm.
I guess I'm thinking at a young age he might not have been because I know whenever he ran away from home and all that sort of stuff. Um, I mean, he obviously fought in many battles, but
Yeah.
I was trying to think of that military connection if he had it as much as the others as Boone and Harrod. But anyway, I guess I'm getting off topic.
That's a good question. I guess where he severs ties so early, it's hard to call on you, when so that may have spared him some of that. But yeah, you're
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, true. So anyway, back to Herod. He fought in many battles there, like you said. Shoot, my mind's left me there. But he goes to Fort Pitt, right?
Mhm.
Is
He
that
does.
mhm,
Yes, he's serving. Of course, that's later in the war, and he's serving at Fort Pitt for a period of time, and sees some action there. And just after that, probably the most influential part of the conflict for him is that all the evidence suggests he is sent to Illinois, and
mhm,
the British, of course, take that from the French, and so the thought is that they're there, establishing forts and checking things out and making sure the French evacuate. And so his older brother Sam is also sent to Pennsylvania, sent from Pennsylvania to Illinois, and they spend some time there before they get back just in time for Pontiac's rebellion. But the two places that stick out to Harrod during that time uh, is again Illinois, which he and his brother will go back to once peace has been established and spend some time there. And while there, Harrod interacts with the Indians a lot. There's already a robust trade network going on there because the French had established that, so they kind of move in on that. Harrod learns French from some sources say he learns from the Native American languages while he's there. So that gets him that backwood experience, and they're not just hanging out in Illinois because the great thing about Illinois is you're on the Mississippi River. So
mhm.
Harrod and his brother are seeing down through the Mississippi Valley, parts of Kentucky and Tennessee. So that creates that love. But then also following their service in even farther in western Pennsylvania than where they were living, they come across 10 Mile Creek, and that's where the family moves to after the war. So that's going to be the launching off point for all of Harrod's future adventures. That 10 Mile Creek area, which is in really southwestern Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So well, that's kind of the thing. You find a lot of these frontiersmen, it's like they get a taste of it out there, and
Mm-hmm.
then they start wanting, like, I'm ready to move out. uh,
Yeah,
but also, like, oftentimes I feel like, you think of frontiersmen, people probably sell them short a little bit. Like one of my notes in the video was about how James Harrod received very little formal education, but yet
right.
here he is out there learning, French, Native American language. Obviously a very intelligent guy. very
Oh,
smart
yeah.
person. And a lot of these frontiersmen were, they had to survive. And, you know, nowadays we think of, education or intelligence as, how many degrees you have or so forth. Wasn't necessarily the case back then. Different
Oh,
world.
absolutely. And some of
Mhm.
these trips, like you say, this is the equivalent of going to the dark side of the moon. So you've got logistics
Yeah.
to figure out. If you're taking 10 guys with you, they got to be fed. And we like to think of the wilderness or across the mountains as this bounty where you could just go and you catch a deer, or there's fruit on the trees. It was a hard life in reality. And so to have supplies that you need, to have the tools that you need, the firearms, and plan for that. All these guys, Boone, Harrod, Kenton, they knew what they were doing. And unfortunately, there were many others who tried who didn't know what they were doing. And there's a reason we're not talking about them. A lot of guys didn't make it back.
Very, very true. Very, very. Oh, I guess mournfully true.
Yeah.
um, so he's in Pennsylvania. He's in the western part of Pennsylvania, and as a relation to say Pittsburgh, because that's the most western city. I guess that would be most people's thought point. How close around this is this to Pittsburgh?
Today, it's probably an hour, 90-minute drive, which is, for a state the size of Pennsylvania, about twice the size of Kentucky. It's not truly that far. I used to know the little town, the modern town that's roughly close to it, but you're right on the West Virginia border. And so you are in that bottom corner. And some of the guys that Harrod will take with him in the future, come from Pennsylvania, but also Maryland, and then over in other areas, because you're right where all the states come together. And their jumping off point will be Moundville in West Virginia. It's been Virginia back then.
Yeah.
So yeah, they are right there, just south of Pittsburgh.
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good picture, I guess, and a lot of mountains in this area as well. We're still in the same Appalachian Mountains that is in Kentucky. They go
Right.
all the way. They go all the way up to Maine, right?
But yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And maybe even into Canada, I guess. um, so he's in Pennsylvania. How long? This would be in the 1760s, correct?
Mhm.
So we're getting close to that voyage, um, which would be in the 70s, right? I mean,
Yes.
that's another thing about Harrod. Not as documented, I guess. I
Mhm.
think it's fair to say.
Very
Boone,
true.
a whole biography, and I mean, if you wanted to now, you could find 10, 20, 30, 40 books about Boone in some
Oh,
sort of way. So again, Harrod though here, not as much documentation, so a little, not as much filler in between things, I guess, is
yeah,
the best way to say it. Uh,
very true.
so go ahead.
No, I said just very true. Yeah.
Mhm. So so basically he's in Pennsylvania, but then he starts rallying up the settlers, I guess, the group, say, hey, let's track into Kentucky.
Yeah, and kind of like with Boone, you mentioned earlier, it was a really good point that they get a taste and you go back home, and you get a taste and you go back home, and Boone would hear stories and that would, kind of stick with him. And the same way with Harrod, they go to Illinois during the French and Indian War, and then he and his brother end up back there for a short time after the war, and then they're back in Pennsylvania. And then it comes time that Virginia has they've got the Proclamation of 1763, which is supposed to prevent settlement over the mountains. And
Yeah,
they've
yeah,
kind of replaced that without the crown's approval with a series of other treaties with the Native Americans. So from Virginia's point of view, they can hand this land out to anybody they want. And they usually contract large land companies. And the first thing they do is send surveyors. So in
yeah,
1773, Harrod goes back to Kentucky with Bullitt. And their goal is to survey the area that would become Louisville, the Falls, the Ohio. And so he's there in 73. And of course, it's kind of a dangerous mission. They do some survey work. And then he says, later that summer, I'm going to scout out an area here, because Virginia had already talked about paying people who had fought in the French and Indian War with land. And it
yeah.
gets dicey here, because was he a Pennsylvanian? Was he a Virginian when he fought? You probably say
Well,
Pennsylvanian if you're Harrod, until they announce that Virginia's giving out free land, and then congratulations, I'm a Virginian, because you were right on the border. But area had been disputed. And so even though they were in the militia, not the regular service, they acted in good faith, thinking that Virginia would eventually approve that. And so he kind of scouts the area in 73, and then you're right, he goes back that summer and begins putting together a team. And there's been a lot of names mentioned. The general consensus is he got 30 guys, but more than that would show up. And, even that's interesting because I just always assumed that Harrod, you grab the neighbors, people you know, people you trust. Certainly that's true for some of these guys. But he had folks from, other places as far away as Central Virginia who had served with him. There were a couple of brothers with the last name Sadowski that come with Harrod in his initial voyage, and they're from Central Virginia. And I thought, why in the world would he grab these guys? But it turns out they had been with him when he went with Bullitt. So these are people he knew. These are people he trusted.
Yeah.
These are people, he could rely on. So, they get everything together, and by the spring of 1774, when you've got all that good weather ahead of you and all those winter rains are driving the current down the Ohio, they are ready to go. And like I said, they leap off from what is now Moundsville, Virginia, or West Virginia. And that starts the adventure.
Mm-hmm. And then the rest is history. When you mentioned Illinois, the Illinois, are we talking about Illinois today, Illinois, or the Illinois territory? As far as like during this war,
it's not 100% clear. A little bit of both, probably. I mean, they're primarily looking at settlements that would be in the current state of Illinois, but they're along the Mississippi River. And there's so little evidence of what Harrod and those guys did there, because we know a detachment is sent out from Pennsylvania. And we know that a couple of the company commanders, I think they're company level commanders, captains that Harrod had served under, are dispatched. So it seems likely. And then also the tax list for that year, Harrod's not on it. So the historian Catherine Mason Harrod, who wrote the book, Catherine Harrod Mason, who wrote the book about Harrod, probably the only biography that's out there today. That's her research, so I can't take credit for that. But putting all that together, it seems likely that they're out there just establishing forts and things. And it's a limited period of time. You want to make sure the French really have evacuated. But it's going to be the Illinois Territory right along the Mississippi River. And, think Kaskaskia and that kind of thing.
Now, the biographer that wrote that, is there a relationship to Harrod?
Yes. I forget what it is, but yes, that's her family somehow. And she wrote that biography in 1950. So it's right around the time that, all the spaghetti westerns are kicking in and you're getting Fess Parker and that kind of thing. So it was right in the spirit of things. And she wanted to make sure his story wasn't left out. And probably not 100% correct on everything, but a really good read and good stuff.
Yeah. So on the southern side of Kentucky, or down on the I guess southern side, I guess that's the best way to say it, in North Carolina, in Virginia, and so forth, something else is going on as far as Richard Henderson is putting together a team, and we kind of have these parallel expeditions going on, I guess, to say it at least. But Boone and them, they're planning their expedition, and we're going to find out as we go, how close they were to, being there at the same time. Harrod, though, beats them, basically.
It is amazing. You're right.
And two, everybody thinks about Kentucky coming through the Cumberland Gap and so forth. But another thing that's looked over with James Harrod is he came down the Ohio River, and a completely different path. And loads of people came that way as well. But we always focus on that Cumberland Gap.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is.
I think there's almost something mystical in that you're blazing a trail where there wasn't one before. And that's not in any way dismissing what Boone and those guys did, because that is a massive feat, to cut the wilderness road. But yeah, you're right. If you're a family, even if you're not near the Ohio River, the better thing for you to do is to head up to Fort Pitt and find, some flat-boated barge and load the family furniture up on there. Because if you're a long hunter and you've got your horse, your dog, and maybe a pack horse, the Gap is great. But if you're bringing a lot of stuff, the Ohio River is the way to go. And so Harrod and those guys take off in March of 1774. And, of course, they go through all the rituals. It's really neat, the frontier culture that exists, because Harrod calls for an election to elect the leader of the expedition. Okay, well, Harrod's organized it. Harrod's the only one that knows where they're going, right? but you have to have that. You have to have this feeling that we are all putting our lives on the line. You got to trust the guy in charge. And so, of course, they elect Herod, and they make their way down, and they get to the spot. They come down the Ohio up to Kentucky, and they get to the spot where it's called Harrod's Landing, and still walk about 10 miles until they get to a large spring. And still bubbles today. You can go see it. So I always tell people it's neat in documentaries, and you see the sweeping vistas, the Appalachian Mountains, and the Ohio River, and they talk about where Kentucky started. Well, it actually started in this pool of water.
Little.
And so that's where they decided to build the town. And they did pretty good. They lost no one to hostile action or accidents on the way down. The only person they lost, and I would love to know the guy's name, but because he didn't go with them, he has been forever forgotten from history. The first day, they stopped to make camp. And, of course, now you've traveled far enough that everything familiar to you is kind of behind you. Kentucky's still a long ways off. And they get to shore, and this guy's just had plenty of time to think, when they're sitting in these dugout canoes. And he jumps out. He said, "The Indians will kill us all. I'm not going." And Harrod tries to talk him back into it. And he said, "No way. It's not happening." And as Harrod's looking around, other people are starting to get antsy. And he's like, "Man, this is going to fall apart before we get there." So everyone back in the boats. So they leave the one guy. He makes his way back, I guess, on foot. And from that point on, the records suggest to us that no one else ever seemed to think of turning back. But in that one moment, the whole thing almost came crashing down on him.
One guy got thinking a little too hard. It's like, "I'm out, boys."
That's right. You sitting in that boat, it's getting dark all around you. I'm glad they didn't turn around, but I can see where he was coming from.
I can see where his mind was headed, and you gotta stay focused. I would say, get out your book and read, or get out your phone and occupy your mind. But they did not have that luxury.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, so they settle up. Like you said, March of 1774. So by June, though, they have established Harrodstown, which it goes through a progression. Harrodstown first, which eventually becomes Harrodsburg, and so forth. And they go down the Kentucky River. I don't know the mileage right off, but pretty good haul to get to what is Mercer County, Harrodsburg now. And that is a very surprising accomplishment that nobody was attacked. Were they attacked at all, or just nobody died?
No attacks. So they made it pretty peacefully.
That is pretty impressive. But if you think about this as well, if you want to think, the Native Americans might not have been watching as much at this point, because nobody was really living in Kentucky. No one was coming in. These are basically the first people. That they're sounding off the alarm. They're going to go down there and get down there, and then they're going to be like, "Hold on, these people are moving in to this area. We're gonna." It makes sense that hostilities would pick up.
Yeah, and, the Shawnee have seasonal hunting camps, and I don't know exactly when they traveled those or what the migration route was, but it could have been that that's more of a summer thing, and they just hadn't got there yet. Because it's surprisingly peaceful, so much so that you think, okay, so they get there in 74. That's when they built Fort Harrod. Fort Harrod's almost a year later. They build a town because they're expecting things to work out. They kind of go out, and this is what causes an issue with Henderson and some of those guys later on. Rather than, here's the center of the town, let's lay off squares, we'll hand them out. Mm-hmm. The first thing they do is they split up in small groups, and you go out and you find the best land. You find the springs, you find the rivers, you find the fields of cane that aren't going to require a lot of clearing, and you mark those. You come back that night, and you all share this news. You split them up. So they're doing that, but then they finally decide to build a town. So everyone's going to get a cabin. And to make sure you didn't work harder on your cabin than the next guy, they built them without knowing who was going to get what. And these are pretty decent structures. We're talking 20 by 30 feet, a story and a half. Mm-hmm. And then they have a lottery, and they draw for them, and you figure out what cabin you're going to be. So if you're with Harrod, you have a cabin in town on Main Street. And I say that jokingly. It was really Broadway today. So if you go to Harrodsburg, Broadway's where it would have been. And then you also have whatever land you had in the country. So, for example, Harrod has a cabin in town, but he ends up settling in Boiling Springs, which is 6 miles south of Harrodsburg. It's in Boyle County. It's in Mercer, but nothing I'm better. No, it's a beautiful place, and that drive is. So.
We'll edit that part out.
Yeah. But so that's their plan, and it seems to go well for them initially. But as the things progress, trouble is brewing back east that they're not aware of. I mean, they're completely cut off, and Lord Dunmore's war is gearing up, which is a war between pretty much just Virginia and the Shawnee. And Boone arrives in Harrodsburg and warns them, that you really need to head back. There's problems coming. And so they pack up, having built these forts, or having built these cabins. And the amazing thing about the cabins, on a side note, someone who visits later, I forget if it's Nicholas Criswell or one of those early journals, says that, they have iron with them. Iron's heavy, and it makes sense. First of all, it's expensive. Second, it's heavy. You don't have a blacksmith. So they're building these log cabins with wooden pegs, largely. So, I mean, that's quite a feat in itself. But they get back. They abandon their settlement for the time being. They go back for Dunmore's war. And actually, Harrod, there's some mixing up with the commission and some of the stuff. His guys arrive at the only major battle, Point Pleasant, just a few hours after it was over. So you have marched back to Virginia. And it's easy coming down the Ohio. It's not easy getting back up it. I'm pretty sure they went back over land. And it turned out to be for naught. But that's in October 1774. They first hear rumblings around that time of some of the revolutionary talk back east. And they realize, there's peace for now, but it's a temporary thing. And so they spend the winter there. They gear up. And in March of 75, they head back down a year later. And from that point on, there's always someone in Harrodsburg.
Yeah, that's a good saying there, or quote, I guess. Now Boone, though, this was Boone, just Boone. I guess it wasn't the big party, I guess, of that was coming, but it wasn't. It is interesting because there was that communication. You have Boone and Harrod here. It's like, hey guys, we gotta go back, or you guys need to head back. Man, that would be a terrible journey to get there and realize, we missed the battle for naught. This was all for naught. That's like going to a ball game or some sort of performance, a concert, and getting there and you don't have your tickets.
Right. Oh yeah.
This is terrible feeling. And in our case, we'd have drove there, not hiked for hundreds of miles or so forth. But anyway, they come back and they build the fort in 1775. And now I know none of any of the original cabins ever preserved, or I mean, they just went out.
I'm pretty sure not. They have found some older cabins. As a matter of fact, we had some local researchers who discovered a really, really old cabin in early 2021 and had their picture in the paper. And you could tell from someone had torn out a modern wall on a small house. And you could tell, the really wide boards and the way they were set up, that it was old. Probably not quite that old. Also, the placement didn't look quite right from where we know the town was. So, I don't think any of those were preserved, but we have some that are pretty old.
Yeah. Well, I think about the actual fort that's there now, and across the street there's that little bitty, looks like a cabin, but it looks like it might be a little too modern. I don't think it's it's not a historic one. Looks cool, but so how big, I guess, compared to Boonesboro, Fort Harrod is same size. What's the, I guess,
it's a little smaller. Yeah, it's larger than the replica you see now. I think that's close to. I'm gonna say this, and I'll turn out to be wrong. I think it's maybe 2/3 the size, something like that. So it's a little larger than the replica, but it's smaller than Boonesboro, and of course it only has blockhouses in 3 corners instead of 4, like Boonesboro does. And the reason for that was they built it around another spring, not the big spring where they had settled originally. But when they built the fort, they retreated up to a hill because there had been some flooding that spring. And similar to Boonesboro, where they had to move farther from the river, Harrod and his guys moved to a higher point called Fort Hill, and they kind of box in a spring. So they have the creek from the original spring filtering in front of the fort, and then they had a smaller spring inside the fort. But because of the runoff, they could only build 3 corners. So it is square, but they've got 3 blockhouses there, and then they had a row of cabins on one wall, and they had some of the rudiments in there to make a school later on and things like that. So
yep. We can talk about that here in a minute. Jane Coombs.
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, I just always try to think of why didn't, which I guess it's probably the location of the river. We're talking about the first settlements or the first towns of Kentucky. Harrodsburg, their intent, they started building a town. When they first got there. Boonesboro, though, they never really did much else, I guess. And I kind of always sometimes wondered, just was that the location, why they were so hesitant, because Richmond became the county seat once it was established, and actually Richmond didn't become the county seat. There was a county, I think there was a county seat before Richmond, but I don't want to get off topic. But anyway,
yeah, it is odd because Boonesboro's. I mean, of course, you got to hike up the hill, to get to Boonesboro from the river. So there's that, but the river's navigable at that point. I mean, it seems, honestly, in some ways, seems like almost a better location than places like Lexington that don't have a connection to a water source that can carry goods to market. So, I don't know why either. You would think that would have been the great spot for that. And Boone probably intended for it to be a town, but it's odd how things develop and people fan out.
Yeah. So as this all is going on in Harrodsburg, like we mentioned, Boonesboro is being built as well. But there's a bit of a conflict, and we'll talk about this. We talk about it as much as we want, I guess. But with Richard Henderson coming in, his intentions were to form a colony, the Transylvania colony, obviously, and wanted it to be separate or to be a state. That's his whole intention. We can talk about him, probably wanting to be governor and make money, then all that kind of stuff. His intentions in that way. However, they have this big meeting at Boonesboro about what should we do, and one of the most vocal against it is James Harrod. Why? I guess we can theorize as much as we want. My thought is that it's because of the Virginia land grants and those sorts of things, and in the situation that he already had in, being in Pennsylvania, but now I'll be a Virginian if I'm going to get a land grant. I could see why that makes more sense, that he would probably be more like, let's stick with being with Virginia.
Right.
That's just my thought process. Any thoughts on that? What do you think?
Well, you're right. Virginia is the reason you have legitimacy to that land. And they have several meetings. And at first, Harrod seems pretty okay with it. He even serves on a couple of committees. They come up with some pretty neat laws. The religious freedom is embraced. They do things like they try to do no profanity. There were conversations about conservation that early because they realized the buffalo aren't going to last forever if you kill them.
Yeah.
So they had some great conversations as far as proposing things, and Harrod seems okay with it. He participates. The guy who opens the ceremony with prayer and closes it is named John Lythe. He's an Episcopalian minister from Harrodsburg. I mean, Harrodsburg is on board. But as it develops and as Henderson's plans begin to come more and more to fruition, the people in Harrodsburg get uneasy because, Henderson wants to have control of how land is distributed. And there have been some people, including Slaughter, who come in later, who are really unhappy with the fact that Harrodsburg and those folks went out and kind of picked the choicest bits of land. They thought that was unfair. Any settlers who came after that were kind of stuck. And Harrod's answer was, well, it's not like we took it from anybody. There was no one here. We simply chose we wanted to settle. We've marked it out. We filed the paperwork. And so as it became increasingly, I don't say apparent, but increasingly possible that Henderson is going to be the arbiter of these disputes and maybe invalidate some of these land claims, Harrod really sours on the whole thing. Yeah. And a lot of people at Harrodsburg do that. And George Rogers Clark ends up there as the military commander for Kentucky. He's not a fan. And eventually Harrodsburg actually writes petitions and sends them back to the Virginia legislators saying, you've got to fix this. And they kind of have a twofold plan. Really, they send 2 petitions back. they say, first, this guy, what he's doing is not legal. Even in the 1770s, you can't just show up and cut a deal with the Indians by yourself and make your own colony. I mean, that's a neat trick. But if he gets away with it, what happens in other places? And we see other movements like this. Tennessee has the state of Franklin that exists for a while as a sovereign nation to them. And finally, North Carolina comes in and says, you can't do that. So that's the first petition. We don't think this is legal. But second, they say, we're part of Fincastle County, and Fincastle County is massive. And is that really good government? I mean, if there's a problem, we're going to go to the county seat. That's not working out. So maybe you should consider creating additional counties, because if Virginia did that, it's going to create government. It's going to create county clerks and sheriffs and all sorts of things that are going to kind of dismantle what Henderson is doing. But to make things worse for Virginia, Henderson has cut a deal with some of the Native Americans. That's true, but his deal is with the Cherokee, who don't own most of central Kentucky. The Shawnee use that land. And so you're setting yourself up for conflict, because you can understand where the Shawnee are coming from. We didn't agree to sell anything. So slowly Richard Henderson's ideas begin to unravel a little, and Boone is stuck in the middle to some degree, because he's sent kind of as a representative to talk to Harrod. And at one point in the Draper Papers, Boone mentions that he is kind of afraid to talk to Harrod because things have deteriorated so far. Harrod's temper is so explosive. He doesn't want to do it. And then Harrod's also gaining a lot of political clout. Yeah, because he's got, they had the families that came back in 75 after the battle at Point Pleasant. And then that fall, families began to come down. So now we have women and children. And it's something we don't think about a lot. We think of it kind of being static. And it's just that original group of settlers. Harrod's got 30 guys with him in 1774. By the spring of 1777, there's 198 people in the fort. Over 50 other are children under the age of 13. Yeah. I mean, they're a family. So, Harrod doesn't feel like he's beholden to anybody, and he thinks probably not in their best interest to go along with Henderson. And that kind of jeopardizes the whole project. And the Virginia legislature agrees, because they not only do they invalidate what Henderson did, they create a new county. And we get the first place officially named Kentucky. That's Kentucky County, Virginia, and December 31st, 1776. And it pretty much made up all of Kentucky except for the area beyond the Tennessee River. That's still Chickasaw country at this point.
Yeah, Jackson Purchase.
That's right. And the county seat, of course, is Harrodsburg.
Harrodsburg. There you go. And, I mean, not to say this, but, I mean, it's a big political move. I mean, like, in a way, because Harrod pretty much gets all the power. Henderson, of course, ends up, going on to, I think, more Western Tennessee or something like that. But basically, he made the move in his best interest for, Henderson's going to be the guy in charge, but instead he ends up kind of being in charge. Not to say that he was directing everybody around and all that, but, ends up being the county seat. Kind of the town's named after him. We're going to stop it right here with our discussion about James Harrod, and we're going to pick it up again next week. Thank you again, David, for coming on, and we will see you all next time. Thanks. Bye. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.